Anarchy in Money on the Ethical Economics of Bitcoin by Max Hillebrand, dedicated to Murray and Satoshi. Abstract. An act is morally righteous only when it is chosen voluntarily. As there is no violation of property rights and natural law, the free market is a complex network of sovereign individuals engaging in mutually beneficial exchange. A money is a store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account, chosen by free market participants. As money is half of every transaction, it is of enormous importance to the economy and society at large. A monetary network which is based on voluntary action and with no systematic theft is both economically and morally righteous. Bitcoin is a money that emerges out of the free and peaceful market, with sovereign nodes declaring their individual monetary rules, presenting themselves to a network of peers, and enforcing consensus rules. With a hard and predictable monetary base and equal opportunity for any individual to enter the market of money production, there is no institutionalized theft via inflation. Thus, Bitcoin is true market anarchy and freedom. Table of contents: natural law and anarchy, sovereign full node, forks, free exchange and interventionism, evolution and attributes of money, money supply and inflation, Gresham's law, speculative attack, scarcity, and conclusion. Chapter 1: Natural Law and Anarchy. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for a people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, and to assume among the powers of the earth and the equal and independent station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the cause which impel them to the change. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive right, inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson. Natural law is a set of universal, inherent, objective, non-man-made, eternal, and immutable conditions that govern the consequence of behavior of beings with the capacity for understanding the difference between harmful and non-harmful action. This law of nature applies to all things objectively and exists independent of human understanding. It is known under several different terms, the law of cause and effect. Effect invariable follows cause. For every action, there exists an equal and opposing reaction. The law of attraction. The energy you emit is the energy you attract. Energy flows where attention goes. As you think, feel, and act, so you shall be. Karma, or moral law. You reap what you sow. Or the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have done to yourself. According to this theory, an action is right when it is based in truth and in harmony with natural law. This action does not result in harm to any other sentient being. Contrarily, any action is wrong when it is not based in truth and in opposition to natural law. Thus, this action does result in harm to other sentient beings. Natural law is derived through apathesis, a method of logical reasoning employed when given a limited set of possibilities in order to arrive at knowledge by way of the exclusion of known negatives. It is describing what something is based on by what it is not. When eliminating the impossible, the remains, regardless how improbable, must be the truth. Natural law is thus affirmation through negation. Any form of the initiation of violence is aggression against other sovereign individuals, and also a violation of their natural right to property. Murder is theft of another's life. Assault is theft on another's physical well-being. Rape is theft of another's sexual consent. Theft is taking another's property and goods. Trespassing is theft of someone's home and land. Coercion is theft of another's free will. Taking something which does not belong to you is always a wrong and immoral act. The initiation of violence is never justifiable. The one single rule of natural law is thus, do not break private property. Any action that does not harm property is thus rightful and in accordance with natural law. Harm no one, do everything. Anarchy is derived from the Greek prefix an, without the absence of, and the Greek noun archon, external master or ruler. It does not mean no rules. Rather, it means without imposed rulers, no masters and no slaves. In other words, freedom. Anarchy is in opposition to authority or the state, as these terms are simply euphemisms for aggression and theft, which are always immoral and in opposition to natural law. There is no legitimacy to the mastery over other people. Freedom is based upon the non-aggression principle and the principle of self-defense against the violation of rights. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but only to have the law of nature for his rule. A sovereign individual has the objective knowledge of which behaviors are rights because they don't harm others, and which are wrong as they do steal from others. Further, once these facts are fully understood and integrated into one's being, and individual action is willfully aligned in accordance to this will, a state of true anarchy, freedom, and peace emerges. All parts of the economy rely on fundamental legal and moral framework, just as society in general requires such ethical guidelines. This is of course true for the creation of production and consumption goods, where firms can strive to achieve prosperity, both economically as well as morally. Most industries are under heavy scrutiny to make sure that no legal or moral code is violated without repercussions. However, one of the most important industries, money production, has so far slipped through the cracks of this due diligence. Chapter 2: Sovereign Full Node. Bitcoin is an electronic peer-to-peer cash system. The important aspect is peer-to-peer. That is, that individual user has full control over the system and does not delegate authority to a representative, centralized party. However, the system is truly trustless if, and only if, the individual user runs a full node. This is a piece of software that can be installed on any hardware. May it be a laptop, a Raspberry Pi, or a smartphone. And by anyone who wants to, without asking for permission. Ultimately, the end user could write this software from scratch, but this is of course very complex and not reasonable to assume. There are several different clients available that can be used in order to communicate with the rest of the network. The most advanced of this software is the Bitcoin Core client. It is fully open source. Each and every line in the code can be seen, copied, changed, and improved by anyone without asking for permission. Thus, everyone can verify the entire software. When downloading the Bitcoin Core client, Alice can set any kind of individual rules that she wants. She could increase the number of Bitcoin in existence, change the proof of work algorithm, change the network routing, or take away control from another UTXO and give herself the control over these coins. There are literally no restrictions on the individual user. She can change anything and everything she wants. Once these rules are set, the node introduces itself to the network and queries for other nodes to communicate with. Alice's node will receive lots of information from many different participants, and she herself will authoritatively verify the adherence to her rules. When the incoming block is valid, for example, the Coinbase reward is 50 Bitcoin, having every 210,000 blocks, she will store it on her drive. However, if according to Alice's rules, the transaction proposed is invalid, for example, a double spend, her node will reject it, block the sending node, and tell her peers about the malicious actor. Alice does not need to trust anyone in the validation process, as she has full access and control of the source code rule set. This is a self-sovereign node, a monarch, a single ruler who rules only the kingdom of self. Sovereignty is a state in which one controls one's own thoughts, the individual rules, emotions, the verification of these rules, and actions, the enforcement of these rules. Of course, as soon as one person changes some of the rules, he might violate the rules of another individual node. Those will recognize him as the aggressor against their individual rules. Because money is a network good, it increases its value exponentially with any additional participant. As soon as someone has a different rules in the system, he is excluded from the network. The user with the minority rule change thus diminishes the value of their network money drastically. Therefore, there is a natural incentive for the individual to use the same rule in his money as the majority of the economy does. Thus, one node software might be used by the vast majority of the network. The Bitcoin Core implementation is very well maintained by the most reputable developers and testers. Thus, it is running on over 95% of public full nodes. Regardless, the individual user has full control over which rules he wants to comply with, and there is no coercion whatsoever. By definition, anyone who runs a full node thus voluntarily agrees to the rules of the network. Nobody is forced to use this software as is. Bitcoin Core is part of the shelling point of Bitcoin, a solution that peers will tend to use in the absence of communication because it seems natural, special, or relevant to them. Not only does the individual user set his own consensus rules, he also verifies each and every single transaction that occurs on this network. If an incoming transaction complies with all the rules the individual set, he will accept this transaction. However, if another node propagates a block which the individual node deems wrong, he can and will ignore this transaction and possibly block the node that sent it. A user with a full node neither has to trust that someone is verifying if the rules are complied with, nor does he have to trust anyone to enforce the rules for him. He does this by himself and without anyone's permission. The reason why Bitcoin works at all is because users validate blocks and make sure that the rules are being followed. Every rule that you aren't validating and the economic majority is validating, is a potential attack. A peer who runs a full node thus chooses which rules he likes, verifies if they are upheld, and if not, punishes the node that don't comply. He is the judge, jury, and executioner. He is the king of his money, the sovereign of his money, and nobody can take this away from him. This is, per definition, anarchy, the absence of coercive rules and masters, but only free, sovereign individuals in voluntary cooperation. This is why Bitcoin is unique and so innovative. Anyone and everyone has full control over his money. Nobody can force him to comply. This is further why closed source and permissioned blockchain projects are simply boring and not innovative. They retain the control by the trusted centralized party and don't give the power to the individual user. It's the intranet filled with stale, boring, and old content. To the internet, a network of freedom, ideas, and without any censorship. The truth that most of the current developers are interested in Bitcoin as a decentralized consensus system existing outside and above the realm of human affairs lose that property, and it ceases to be an interesting system. I am passionate about Bitcoin. I have zero passion for majority vote to change the rules of the system. We have one of those already, and it's called Fiat. Forks. All aspects of Bitcoin are fully transparent and open source. Thus, anyone who is interested has access to the Bitcoin core implementation and source code. As code is speech and a non-scarce good, it can be copied, adapted, and changed at barely any marginal cost. A problem with coins that trade on novelty rather than utility is that the market creates novelty faster than these developers can. The code repository can easily be forked off, so to experiment with changes in the code base without affecting the existing consensus implementation. This code fork is not necessarily consensus critical and can be done without permission. A change in the code can be proposed to be pulled back into the reference client, but this is done after rigorous peer review and only when majority consensus is reached. Ultimately, the end user alone is deciding which software he is running, and no malicious actor can force him to install any updates. Bitcoin is consensus code that leads to a Schelling point, a standard that people will tend to use in the absence of communication. Thus, a consensus fork is a divergence in the implementation of the verification consensus rules, which can impede the expected eventual convergence of the network in a single chain that has the most proof of work and also satisfies the rules. This can be intentional or caused by a bug in consensus validation re-implementations. A hard fork is a change to the Bitcoin protocol which loosens restrictions or removes rules. That is, that some previously invalid blocks are now considered valid. This might include an increase in the block size, signature operations in the block, or the maximum number of coins. But there are no limits on what could be changed, because old nodes will consider these new nodes as violators of the original consensus. Each individual node will block and ostracize these aggressors immediately. Even if 99% of nodes accept these new rules and implement the software, they cannot make the 1% upgrade. And these will still run the original individual rules. Thus, even with a hypermajority update, the change is a hard fork, and the minority network will continue. However, at the immense risk of a 51% attack. Because the change is considered invalid by status quo nodes, non-adopting miners build upon each other's blocks, creating two separate chains. This is especially concerning as SPV nodes do not check for the block versioning field, and thus they do not see the hard fork blocks at all. All after the hard fork, there will be two different networks and blockchain continuously running. Only the self-sovereign nodes themselves decides which rules to adhere to, and the Schelling point of Nakamoto consensus. Usually, the UTXO set of an old chain will be utilized as the starting UTXO set of the forked chain. Thus, everyone who had control of Bitcoin before the split will gain additional forked coins. These additional UTXOs might be considered a gift by the developers of the new coin to incentivize users to implement the protocol change. Some projects that fork the Bitcoin consensus argue that this new set of rules is considered to be the true Bitcoin. This is fallacious in many ways. As Satoshi said, the nature of Bitcoin is such that once version 0.1 was released, the core design was set in stone for the rest of its lifetime. A key attribute to Bitcoin is its unchangeability. The fact that individual nodes cannot be forced to modify their software and rule set. Once the precedence of a consensus critical change is made, the risk of another change is more likely, as seen with the recent Bcash hard fork, the following splintering and continuous forks. Once the precedent of coercive forking as a method of governance is set, and nodes give up their sovereignty, it is ever more difficult to reclaim individual control over the protocol. This is in part due to the inherent centralizing nature of a hard fork that is being advocated for by a minority group. Bitcoin does not change precisely because it is leaderless. And any change requires strong advocacy of someone. Due to the monetary value involved in hard forks, a technical debate often shifts to a political one. Individuals who invest much time and effort into developing a hard fork often aspire to become a leader, as humans often look for guidance and leadership, especially in highly complex environments. These people often rise to a new Satoshi-like status. They are assumed to be wise and often get significant say in decisions they shouldn't necessarily be involved in. Many dubious personalities went down this path in the past, but haven't been able to gain any long-term significant influence in the original Bitcoin project. A soft fork is a change of the rule set which tightens the parameter or adds rules. This means that all new blocks are still considered valid under the original consensus. This means that there are new clients are restraining themselves and putting additional rules in place which are more constrained than the previous ones. Such a rule change is backwards compatible because old nodes see this new rule set as valid. Contrarily to a hard fork, a soft fork can be applied by only one individual node, as this node does not break consensus. This is an opt-in model. Thus, all users voluntarily agree to constrain their own set of rules. And those that do not want to play by these rules stick to the original consensus, but stay on the same network and blockchain as those that support the soft fork. Although the full node have complete control over their rule set and can change it at any time, the resulting blockchain is only secure against reorganization and double spending attacks if the majority of hashing power is honest. Thus, the nodes have to incentivize enough miners to support this chain, which is done by Coinbase reward and transaction fees. A soft fork can introduce radical changes. A soft fork can introduce radical changes. Sorry. Thus, the nodes have to, a soft fork can introduce radical changes. For example, that if larger than 95% of the past 2,000 blocks voted for Bitcoin 2.0, all blocks must, number one, vote for Bitcoin 2.0, number two, contain exactly one transaction, the Coinbase, and number three, the Coinbase must include the hash of a valid Bitcoin 2.0 block. This soft fork thus commits to an entirely new Bitcoin 2.0 protocol, which could be anything at all. Thus, a soft fork is not, per definition, a positive event for Bitcoin and can be very contentious. All forks degrade security. The question is, how badly? Thus, when updating the protocol, a soft fork is less contentious than a hard fork, and thus, in general, preferable. Historically, soft forks have been employed after 95% of blocks supported it, signaled by the version field in the block header, and blocks that don't support the soft fork are considered invalid. Blocks from miners that do not adopt the soft fork are still produced, 1/20th of all blocks, but they are considered invalid and thus orphaned off. After years of research and development, it was clear that segregated witness is an overall net positive to the entire network. SegWit fixes the malleability bug, which makes second-layer solutions like the Lightning Network, and further complex smart contracts, such as Chaumian coin joins, possible. Because the signature part is segregated from the block itself, this is an increase in the block weight and therefore increases the maximum amount of transactions per second. Furthermore, with the versioning upgrade mechanism, other signature schemes such as Schnorr signatures or BLS can be added in the future with another soft fork. Only after enough research and with sufficient development and peer review did the core process push for an update in the consensus rules. A dedicated group of individuals can manifest this change in the Bitcoin consensus protocol as long as they do not violate the rules of other full nodes. Initially, the upgrade mechanism was deployed in a way where miners had to signal the usage and agreement to the SegWit soft fork. As these service providers tried to block and delay the SegWit activation, sovereign nodes banded together and declared to no longer accept proof of work of miners who were actively blocking this voluntary soft fork. The act of not doing business with another individual is fundamentally based in voluntary interaction and the right to be left alone. As long as the user-activated soft fork does not break the consensus rules of another individual node, it is ethically righteous. The SegWit UASF shows that sovereign full nodes are in full control over their own implementation. After SegWit got activated, a small group of individuals tried to implement a new code repository as the main consensus reference, with a hard fork increasing the block size to 2 MB. This hard fork was to be implemented and activated by the hashing power of miners, signaling their support. This miner-activated hard fork stands as the complete antithesis to the user-activated soft fork. A small minority of researchers, developers, and enterprise try to introduce a change to consensus which would break the previously agreed upon rule set, a hard fork. Only after massive pushback from the community No 2X did a small minority give up and stop their effort to force a rule change on everyone else. Due to serious flaws in the code and an off by one error, the hard fork would have never taken place anyhow. Regardless, these individuals could never have forced other full nodes to accept and play by these new set of rules. The shelling point of Bitcoin is the status quo. As the core attribute of Bitcoin is financial self-sovereignty, and therefore the unchangeability of consensus rules, upgrades and improvements to the network are always going to be a contentious matter. It is curious to see how upcoming changes are proposed and handled in the core process. There are still many features to be added to Bitcoin, primarily regarding its privacy and fungibility aspect. Although the research and development of tools such as confidential transactions and Schnorr signatures are advanced and currently going through rigorous peer review, implementing these major changes will be a heavily debated topic worth further study. The main challenge will be to introduce these features in a non-contentious but voluntary matter, primarily with a soft fork. Chapter 4: Free Exchange and Interventionism. Throughout history, there is a prominent display of free and voluntary exchange between individuals who walk away after this trade better off because otherwise they wouldn't do it freely. Why is this? Let us examine the following hypothetical construct of Alice and Bob, who are living on a lonely island. Alice is a very skilled apple picker, gathering 20 apples per hour, but not a good berry picker, only gathering 30 berries per hour. Bob can gather 80 berries per hour, but due to a lack of skill, he can only gather 10 apples per hour. If these two decide to work only for themselves for 2 hours, Alice can produce 20 apples and 30 berries. Bob can produce 10 apples and 80 berries. However, they can decide to specialize individually on the task which they are marginally better at. So Alice producing 40 apples and Bob gathering 160 berries. On Alice's individual preference scale, she prefers 80 berries over 10 apples. On Bob's individual preference scale, he prefers 10 apples over 80 berries. They have a unique opportunity to engage in voluntary trade of 1 apple to 80 berries. After this exchange, Alice has 20 apples and 80 berries. Bob has 20 apples and also 80 berries. Both are better off, making the trade mutually beneficial. Both will walk away saying thank you and appreciating the work the other party has done in respect, cooperation, and peace. The free market is so beautiful precisely because it is mutually beneficial throughout the entire process. One can only express the individual's preference scale with the action of exchange. And if this is done freely and voluntarily, it implies the higher value of the traded good. The overall value of all individuals and the entire economy is increased by free exchange. Specialization is encouraged. Division of labor is encouraged. Free trade is encouraged. It implies the natural right of the individual to do with his property as he pleases, as long as he doesn't harm any other sentient being. Clearly, exchanging the property for a different good is an inherent part of his right, and to deny it is to imply expropriation and slavery. As Rothbard put it, there are three different types of interventionism: autistic, binary, and triangular. Each inherently breaks the beauty of the free market and is not at all mutually beneficial. One individual or group of individuals uses violence or the threat thereof to become the master, the tyrant or state. The other individual or group of individuals become the oppressed, the slave. Any form of interventionism is thus a violation of property rights and natural law, and thus political, uneconomical, and immoral. First, in an autistic intervention, the state denies that individual to use his property in a way that is not in accordance with the state's decree, although the individual would not hurt anyone else in his intended action. Prohibition is an example where the state punishes the righteous production and consumption of a good, such as alcohol or marijuana. Thus, the state implies a higher right to the individual's property and his person, which of course fundamentally breaks the natural law. The state gets the outcome it intended and receives its higher valuation. However, the oppressed individual is worse off, no matter his intention of adherence to this man-made so-called law. In the case that he did not want to produce or consume the forbidden good due to the implied threat of violence, and in the case he wanted to produce or consume the good because he is forcefully prohibited from partaking in this peaceful action, which is his own property to gain additional value. In a free market, the individual will be counseled, suggested, and persuaded peacefully and non-coercively, without the threat of violence, to stop the action. But the individual can at any time deny and ignore the counseling. He only accepts it if it's of value to him, making it again mutually beneficial interaction. In binary intervention, the state forces or coerces the individual to interact with the state. So the individual has no way of declining. Taxation is an example where the state forcefully expropriates without the explicit consent a portion of the individual's income, theft, and product of labor, slavery. Again, the state gets the higher valued outcome, the ownership of the individual's property, and the individual is again oppressed regardless of his intention to exchange or not with the state. Even if the individual was voluntarily intending to pay the contribution, the threat of violence inevitably decreases his well-being. And of course, if he did not intend to pay the contribution, he was forcefully removed from his rightful ownership and is therefore, by definition, worse off. In some occasions, the individual or society at large might get back some or all of the stolen property in form of grants, services like public education, roads, or security. But nevertheless, the property was first involuntarily stolen and is thus never employed in the individual's highest valuation. Due to the cost of bureaucracy, the aggregated amount of stolen property is always higher than the aggregated amount of employed public grants and services. In the free market, all exchanges are engaged in voluntarily and therefore not taxation, but rather a payment of voluntary service. Exactly the same to the exchange of any other goods or service. In triangular intervention, the state forces two individuals to only engage in trade with the rules set forth by and the permission of the state. Examples are registration, licensing, and forced contract covenants. The state gets the higher value outcome of control, and the individual gets oppressed again, even if they intended to obey the law due to the threat of violence. And also if they did not want to engage in the contract forced upon them by the state. Triangular intervention can be subdivided into price controls and product controls. The aggressor can either set a minimum price, which will hurt the customer as he must pay more than he would voluntarily choose to, and thus less will be consumed. Or a maximum price, which means that the entrepreneur might have to carry a loss, as not all their expenditures are covered. Regardless, as this dictated price is not the voluntarily chosen market price, it is inherently not mutually beneficial and thus destroys resources and capital. In regards of money, price controls inevitably lead to Gresham's law. Also, the state can manipulate the nature of production directly, rather than the terms of exchange. This is that the aggressor prohibits the production or sale of a certain product, which will again lead to a net loss for all participants. The consumer loses utility as he cannot acquire the goods with which he could satisfy his desires. And the producer, who prohibited from earning the revenue and that the exchange would have brought him. The only one that will benefit from this coercion is the aggressor himself, partly from the tax or license which is collected, or from the twisted satisfaction of suppressing others. Evolution and attributes of money. Why has society always used a money as an integral part of their economic structure and everyday life? Is money useful or wasteful? Is it nourishing or destructive? Throughout history, several different goods have been used as a money. So when speaking of money, one must not constrain the thinking to present-day currencies, such as US dollar, euro, or yen. Stones, feathers, shells, gems, pearls, gold, and many items more have been used by civilization as a money. What is of interest in this chapter are the fundamental origins of money and why it is being used freely and willingly. Further, the specific attributes that make a good suitable for being used as a money. In the hypothetical construct of a small and separate economy of the lonely island, Alice is specializing in apple picking and Bob in picking berries. However, this direct exchange is very limited due to the double coincidence of one's problem. In order for Alice and Bob to trade, each of them has to possess a good that the other person values higher than their own. However, if Alice values her good higher than Bob's proposed transaction good, she is going to trade willingly. And therefore, if Bob wants to acquire Alice's good, he needs to find a good that she values higher than her own. For example, wood. Bob can either produce this wood himself, which requires employing capital over time, or he can seek an individual that has already accumulated such capital and specializes in producing wood. Charlie lives on the lonely island and is specializing in lumber and is a specialized lumberjack. And due to his accumulated capital and experience, he can produce 10 logs of wood per hour. Charlie values Bob 80 berries higher than 5 of his wood logs, and Bob does not want to consume the wood logs himself, for example, to build a cabin, but he ultimately wants to consume Alice's apples. But because Alice is willing to trade her apples for wood, Bob can purchase the wood from Charlie to later extend it for Alice's apples. The wood is for Bob neither a production nor a consumption good, but rather a medium of exchange, which he only values in the present in order to later have a liquid and available good to exchange with and acquire either a production or a consumption good. To preserve the purchasing power, it is beneficial for a medium of exchange with the highest salability. The emergence of a money is a process over a long period of time and is proceeding in several steps. Initially, as a scarce digital collectible, then a store of value, medium of exchange, and ultimately a unit of account. First, in order for money to be useful, it has to be exchangeable for other goods. Where Alice relinquishes control over her money and Bob gives up the possession of his berries. This aspect of scarcity is essential for functioning money, as non-scarce good can be multiplied and shared so that Alice would retain a copy of such money. The information transmitted on the internet is a non-scarce good, and it is very remarkable that the Nakamoto consensus in Bitcoin morphs this information in such a way that a scarce good emerges. As Alice is signing the Bitcoin transaction, she is advancing the chain of signatures that represent the UTXO, so that it is now pointing to the public address of Bob. And only with control over Bob's private key can this output be ever spent again. Assuming sufficient fees paid and overall valid transactions, this transferal of the control is confirmed with accumulated proof of work on the Bitcoin blockchain. If Alice can take back the good after giving it to Bob, then she has reversed the trade and broken the private contract that she has initially voluntarily agreed to. Thus, the attribute of scarcity must not only be upheld for a short period of time, but continuously and reliably. Even with malicious actors, in Bitcoin, one UTXO must only be used once and not be double spent. So to prevent the creation of counterfeit currency and inflation of the money supply, Nakamoto consensus declares a time ordering of transactions in blocks that hash to a value below a certain difficulty target. Once a valid block is found, it can be assumed that the miner proposing the ordering of transaction has expanded energy and work to do so. Each block refers to the previous block, thus creating a chain of accumulated proof of work. And in order to rewrite this chain, hash calculations have to be performed. It is computationally exponentially more expensive to reorganize the chain of blocks with increasing percentage of honest miners. With an assumption of 50% non-malicious miners, the chain with the most accumulated proof of work is considered to be the one valid chain containing the true transaction history. Alice and Bob have unique and individual preferences, which they will strive to satisfy. They will seek to accumulate scarce goods in order to remove their uneasiness of desire. With the Genesis block, the first 50 Bitcoin issued in the Coinbase reward, Satoshi received the first amount of scarce Bitcoin. Ever since then, a new block issues the next set of fresh UTXOs to the database, thus increasing the supply of the good so that more people can accumulate this digital scarce collectible. By expanding work, the medium of exchange is not directly used in the present, but rather in an uncertain future exchange. It is important that the good does not lose much of its value during that storing period. If Bob picks his berries today, but plans on trading with them in the distant future, the berries will be rotten, and rotten berries are of course not as valuable than fresh berries. Thus, they do not store their value effectively. Bob has lost much of his wealth because he has chosen a non-durable good to store his wealth. But even with a durable good that does not decay over time, if the demand for the good is lower in the future, the exchange value will decrease. If Charlie stores his wealth in wood, thinking that Alice will want to build a cabin soon, but it turns out that Alice does not want to do this, she will not demand wood in exchange. Thus, the value of Charlie's wood decreases. The better the good retains its purchasing power, the more suitable it is as a store of value. As new entrepreneurs enter the economy, they introduce their own skills and goods they have produced. These individuals sell their goods and services in trade for their money. Thus, everyone who holds this medium of exchange will gain access to these new products. This will increase the network and overall utility of the money, thus pushing up the demand for holding the monetary unit. As the network continues to increase, so does its anti-fragility. The ecosystem has a convex response to a stressor or source of harm, leading to a potentially sensitive increase in volatility. With the money being traded across the economy and individuals are buying and selling their money, the liquidity increases, and thus the price volatility should decrease. One single market actor will have a thinner percentage of market depth, and that he will not affect the overall market price very much. In the simplified barter economy, there is no universal price for any good. One unit of Alice's apple will have several different prices: the berry price in terms of Bob's berries, and the wood price in terms of Charlie's wood. In more complex barter economy, every good has a quasi-infinite array of prices in terms of every other good. Every seller has to price his goods in many different goods and keep track on all the exchange values for each and every good. This is, of course, very cumbersome and costly. Deep production stages are very hard to calculate because of the limited possible trades and the expensive recurring adjustment of prices. This is a state of uneasiness which will be relieved in the free market. As more and more people use the same store of value and medium of exchange, the value of this good further increases, thus incentivizing more participants to use it. The more the same good is used in exchange, the more goods are priced in terms of that one good. Thus, there is a natural tendency towards one single unit of account, in which all the goods are being priced. This opens up the possibility of vast and interconnected production stages in a complex economy. The good, which is the most common store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account in the economy, is called the money. Of course, every good can become a money, but the good with the most saleable will tend to be the single money. Due to the network effect, the saleability of the money increases exponentially with each new participant in the money economy. Thus, there is a natural tendency towards one single money to the free and voluntary market. This must not be confused with government legal tender laws, which force market participants to use one single money. But the expected value will be the decisive factor determining how much of it the public will wish to hold. And the issuing bank will soon discover that the desire of the public to hold its currency will be the essential circumstances on which its value depends. The crucial point is to keep in mind will be that to keep a large and growing amount of this currency in circulation, it will not be demanded for borrowing, but the willingness of the public to hold it will be decisive. Money supply and inflation. An increase in the stock is caused by an increase in the production of money, and decreased by decay, unrecoverable loss, and use in production. Because the money will be chosen to be durable, And because the money itself is neither consumed nor used up in production, proportional increases of the money supply will be quite small. The question arises if there exists an optimal quantity of money and how much money should be in supply. Economists argue whether the supply should move in accordance with population growth, economic growth, volume of trade, velocity of trade, the amount of goods produced, or according to the demand, so to keep a stable purchasing power. Many ignore the possibility of leaving the decision to the free and voluntary market. Money differs from other goods in one essential attribute. An increase in the supply of consumption goods leads to more options and a higher living standard for the individual. With more production goods, more consumption goods can be built, thus further increasing future prosperity. Additional land and other natural resources promise more production and consumption, both in the present and the future. Consumption goods are used up by consumers, and capital goods are used up to produce more consumption goods. But money is not used up. It is neither a consumption nor a capital good, but rather a store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account, used to postpone the gratification of needs and desires, increase the number of possible trading pairs, and decrease the complexity and cost of overall trade. If Alice is willing to trade her apples for 3 monetary units, the price of the apple is 3 money units. A money is a unit of account, thus all prices are denominated in this good. If it represents the amount of goods 1 money unit can purchase, just like the price of the apple represents the amount of money 1 apple can be traded for. The price of money is thus the inverse of the price of all available goods, with an increase in supply of money and unchanging demand. The price of money will fall. Thus, the price of all other goods denominated in this money will increase. The opposite is true for the decrease in the quantity of money. In the hypothetical construct of helicopter money proposed by John Stuart Mill, each individual will simultaneously receive an equal proportion of new money. Let's assume that Alice has 50 money units, Bob 30, and Charlie 20. And the total supply instantly doubles to 200. Now Alice has 100 money units, Bob 60, and Charlie 40. Are they now magically twice as rich? Did this increase their purchasing power? Obviously not. Alice still has 50%, Bob 30%, and Charlie 20% of the total money units and purchasing power in the economy. Only an abundance of goods can increase prosperity, and this is limited by the scarcity of the resources, land, labor, and capital. Simply increasing the money supply does not bypass economic laws. They might feel more wealthy initially because of the increase in the nominal holdings of money, but soon they will realize that their percentage of the total quantity of money remains equal. As individuals barter for the price of the exchange following the increase in supply, the demand for all goods will roughly double, which will eventually lead to a doubling, but at least an increase in the price of goods. The next price is reached when demand is satisfied and new money no longer bids against itself for the goods. Therefore, while the increase in supply of money will, as with any other good, lead to a decrease in the price of money, but this does not lead to an increase in the benefit of society. Thus, it does not matter what the supply of money is. Any quantity of supply will work just fine, as long as the units can be divided for smaller transactions. On the free and voluntary market, the individual will simply adjust their prices so that the same degree of purchasing power as before the change in supply. This adjustment process will take a considerable amount of time, effort, and cost, and thus even in the hypothetical construct of helicopter money, changing the money supply is not just useless, but actually spawns unnecessary cost and uncertainty. However, in the real economy, it is impossible to have an instantaneous increase in the money supply. Some market participants receive the new money before others. The consequences are called Cantillon effects. Let's again assume the initial state with Alice's 50 money units, Bob 30, and Charlie 20. But the 100 inflated money units go directly and solely to Alice. Alice now controls 75%, Bob 15, and Charlie only 10%. It is logical that Alice, having received the money first, benefits at the expense of Bob and Charlie, because her percentage of the total money has risen while Bob's and Charlie's has declined. Further, Bob and Charlie have not yet adjusted their prices upwards to reflect the dilution of the money supply. Alice's purchases some berries from Bob for 10 money units, and thus the price per berries increases, which adjusts Bob's purchasing power upwards, but only to 20%, which is still below the initial equilibrium. If Bob now purchases wood from Charlie for 5 monetary units, Bob has the advantage of buying the wood for not yet adjusted prices. After the exchange, Charlie will adjust the price according, and his purchasing power is now 12.5%. Because Alice is the sole money producer, she is stealing purchasing power from Bob and Charlie, who cannot defend against this hidden taxation. Contrarily, if Alice loses 20 monetary units, her purchasing power decreases to 37.5%. Bob's increases to 35.7%, and Charlie's increases to 25%. Alice has lost both in the quantity of money units and in her percentage allocation of the total supply. However, Bob and Charlie have not gained additional units, but as the total supply has deflated, their percentage has increased. Alice has to cut her spending and thus suffers the most. Bob and Charlie see their buying prices fall before their income is cut, and thus they benefit. Thus, Bob and Charlie gain at the expense of Alice, but this is entirely due to Alice's fault and with no wrongdoing from Charlie. We can observe following law. When a change in the money relation causes prices to rise, the man whose selling price rises before his buying price gains, and the man whose buying price rises first loses. The one who gains the most from the transaction period is the one whose selling price rises first and buying price lasts. Conversely, when the prices fall, the man whose buying price fall before his selling price gains, and the man whose selling price falls before his buying price loses. The greater and longer the positive difference between the selling and buying price, the greater and longer the negative effects, the greater the loss. Which participants gain and lose depends on the relative time that they receive the newly printed money as it gets diffused throughout the economy. It has to be noted that the old and new relative prices and valuation are not identical. Even if the individual valuation would be frozen throughout the adjustment process, the shift in relative prices change the overall demand structure, first for the gainers, later for the losers. The same is the case for the time preference, even in the helicopter money construct. Not all prices will double automatically because everyone has a unique demand for money. The exact amount and direction of the shift of the demand structure can, of course, not be predicted by economists, as they rely solely on the unique individual valuation of countless market participants. According to Nakamoto consensus in Bitcoin, there is a set issuance rate of new money units. Initially, 50 new Bitcoins every block can be created and given directly to the miner, who finds valid proof of work. Every 210,000 blocks, or roughly 4 years, this number is halved, first to 25 Bitcoin, then to 12.5 Bitcoin, and eventually no new Bitcoin will be created in the year 2141, with a total number just shy of 21 million Bitcoin in existence. The issuance scheduled is part of the Nakamoto consensus, and therefore it can only be changed, and an overwhelming majority individual nodes agree to such a drastic change. As seen with No2x, even for rather trivial change such as a block size security parameter, it is nearly impossible to reach consensus. It is safe to say that such a fundamental change will not be adopted easily and without pushback, if merged at all. One of the unique attributes of Bitcoin regarding inflation is the difficulty adjustment period of 2016 blocks, where the accumulated proof of work is verified against the target time frame of 1 block every 10 minutes. If more hashing power has entered the network over the last 2 weeks, the difficulty of finding valid proof of work is increased. If hashing power has exited the network, the difficulty is decreased. This seems like a very trivial procedure, but its effects are very important. Individuals value gold, as it is a good store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. Thus, they are willing to pay a price to acquire this money. Thus, entrepreneurs take on capital and production costs of gold in order to sell it at a profit. As more peers use gold as their money, the network expands and the price rises. Thus, more miners can enter the market and cover their costs with the revenue. This, however, increases the total money supply of gold, increasing the uncertainty in the economy and shifting the purchasing power from the holders to the money producers. This is downward pressure on the price of gold. Bitcoin, similarly to gold, is a very useful money. Thus, individuals value it and acquire it at a price from the entrepreneurs who are producing Bitcoin. These are miners who are packaging individual transactions in their candidate block and hashing it until the difficulty target is met. As a reward, the miner can give himself newly created Bitcoin in the Coinbase transaction, starting a new chain of digital signatures. As the network grows, more peers will value Bitcoin. New miners are incentivized to enter the market and start hashing candidate blocks. Now, sooner rather than later, a new block will be found, which in the short run will increase the issuance rate, as the 2016 blocks will thus be found faster than 2 weeks. However, for the next period, the difficulty target will be decreased. Thus, it takes proportionally more hashes until a valid block is found. This stabilizes the stock-to-flow ratio, and the uncertainty of changing issuance rate is drastically reduced. Thus, in the long run, the increase of the money supply is highly predictable, and the security against reorganization attacks is drastically increased. On the contrary to all previous monies, with an increase in users, not the money supply, but the security of the network is increased. This leads to even more peers using Bitcoin, which starts the cycle all over again. This positive feedback loop increases the security, but leaves the inflation schedule untouched. There is thus no downward pressure on the price due to an increase in the money supply. The quantity of Bitcoin created is pre-programmed and cannot be altered, no matter how much effort and energy is expended into proof of work. Difficulty adjustment is the most reliable technology for making hard money and limiting the stock-to-flow ratio from rising. And it makes Bitcoin fundamentally different from every other money. Bitcoin is the hardest money ever invented. Growth in its value cannot possibly increase the supply. It can only make the network more secure and immune to attacks. Gold became the primary money of every civilized society, this precisely because it was the hardest to produce. But Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment makes it even harder to produce. In a sense, it is more typical to gold or other precious metals. Instead of the supply changing to keep the value same, the supply is predetermined and the value changes. As the number of users grow, the value per coin increases. It has the potential of a positive feedback loop. As users increase, the value goes up, which could attract more users to take advantage of this increasing value. Monopoly prevents people from using what is rightfully their property, and thus prevent them from competing with privileged market participants. This is partial theft. Thus, when there exists a state monopoly on the production of money, it is inherently stealing the private property of entrepreneurs seeking to enter this market and provide a service to their customers. This is theft, regardless if the monopoly entity will inflate the money supply. However, those that have the power to print money are incentivized to misuse this power. In order to prevent this from happening, in Bitcoin, anyone can enter the marketplace to produce new Bitcoin by performing proof of work through hashing. All that is needed in order to calculate this mathematical function is a piece of paper and a pen. It is neither required to disclose one's identity nor use any specific hardware or ask for permission. Mining is performed by a dynamic set of unknown and untrusted entrepreneurs. Not even Satoshi had extra privileges, as he had to prove his work even for the Genesis block. Although he was initially the only miner, he could not exclude anyone from competing against him. Precisely because anyone can enter this marketplace, the inflation evident in Bitcoin is neither unethical nor uneconomical. In fiat systems with legal tender laws, inflation is theft because it shifts the purchasing power from the savers to the money producers, and the users didn't voluntarily agree to the redistribution, and they are forced to use the currency as it depreciates in purchasing power. However, the consensus rules in Bitcoin were set in 2009, and anyone who runs a Bitcoin full node can decide which rules to follow. Any arbitrary change to the open source software is not just possible, but encouraged, because anyone can adapt the rules by definition. If an individual node is connecting to the network, it is voluntarily agreeing to the rules in this network, including the inflation schedule. Therefore, the Bitcoin inflation rate is accepted voluntarily and thus neither coercion nor theft. There is no inherent moral problem with the voluntary issuance rate. However, there might be an economic issue. As described earlier, the Kantian effect favors the money producers over the savers and shifts the purchasing power from one to another. This creates two problems: malinvestments and overconsumption. One, on the entrepreneur side, Because as the quantity of money increases, more money is available for investments, and the new money is allocated to rather less profitable and more risky opportunities, which have the potentially greater return, but also a higher chance of default. In a sound economy, the amount of purchasing power dedicated to new investments depends on the saving rates of market participants. Thus, entrepreneurs might assume that the additional money available for investment comes from consumers who postpone their satisfaction of needs in an uncertain future. In the case, it would be profitable for the entrepreneurs to increase the production stages and build higher order goods. However, as in the case of an inflationary money supply, the additional money is not derived from consumer savings, but rather printed out of thin air. Consumers are actually not saving for future consumption, rather they are consuming more in the present. On the other hand, consumers have a choice of satisfying their need right now or later in an uncertain future. This time preference is unique to each individual and is evident in the interest rate, which reflects the postponement of gratification. With an increase in the money supply, its price will decrease, incentivizing the immediate exchange of consumption. Consumers are thus incentivized to postpone savings and increase their current consumption. This behavior is rational in an inflationary economy, but is directly contrary to the expectations of the entrepreneurs. Because everyone can become a miner and create blocks, the new money is spread throughout the economy and not to a third party, a central party. Thus, no one is the sole beneficiary of the inflated money, which decreases the Cantillon effects. Further, the issuance rate is set and publicly known by all market participants. Nevertheless, this economic law is prevalent in Bitcoin as well. The goods subsidized by inflation are, number one, security on the production side, and number two, the block space on the consumption side. Number one, because of the inflationary block reward, entrepreneurs, in this case the miners, invest more than the users are willing to pay for mining. There is more hashing power in the network, ceteris paribus, compared to a system without such a block reward. Although one might argue that the additional mining power and security is beneficial and needed to bootstrap Bitcoin, it nevertheless is a malinvestment. More security is being produced than the individual user is willing to pay for. The logical conclusion is that the current hyper-exponential growth in Bitcoin's accumulated proof of work is not in line with the current need of users. As soon as the inflationary subsidy will decrease, the cost of the security has to be carried by direct transaction costs only. It will become evident that the entrepreneurs have produced too much security and that Bitcoin users are not willing to pay this much directly with transaction fees. Because users might not increase the Satoshis per V-byte transactions, including fees, miners will no longer be profitable and cannot amortize their investments in mining chips, electricity, and know-how. These miners, who have not anticipated the correct demand for security, have overinvested and will no longer be profitable. They will cease operations, which will lower the total hash rate and thus security. The hash rate will continue to drop to that amount which the users are willing to pay for. The correction is inevitable, but due to the difficulty adjustment, not a problem for security and block confirmation time. 2. There are costs in securing the Bitcoin network with mining. And these costs are paid for by the individual users with transaction fees that go directly to the miner. The more security the user wants, the more transaction fee he has to pay. The additional fees will incentivize new miners to start hashing, and this will increase the security against reorgs and double spends. However, the payment for the service security is subsidized by the block reward, which gives the miners additionally to the transaction fees the newly inflated Bitcoin. The direct cost for the user, the transaction fees, are thus comparatively low. Because the miner can pay his production cost in part with the newly issued Bitcoin, the block space is thus relatively cheap for the end user, compared to a network without inflation. Therefore, users will consume more of the blockchain. For example, they will make more transactions than they otherwise would. Apps like Satoshi's Dice will use up block space, although the amount of security in the network might be considered way too high for such a use case. Satoshi's Dice could work perfectly fine in a network with less security, which would increase efficiency at a lower cost. For example, the Lightning Network. The cultural consequences of inflation are long-lasting. When the money supply is constantly increased, the purchasing power of the money is continuously depreciated. Thus, with the same nominal amount of currency, tomorrow you can purchase less goods and services. Therefore, Alice is incentivized to consume today, thus increasing her time preference and lowering her planning horizon. Because she is fearful that tomorrow she still has less purchasing power to satisfy her needs and desires, she is pushed to consume as much and as soon as possible. Alice no longer plans for the future generations as her wealth is degraded over time. As this culture of inflation and theft is manifested across several generations, the result is an uncertain and fearful society consuming weak products. Entrepreneurs are incentivized to introduce planned obsolescence, so to have recurring consuming customers offsetting their loss in wealth. A one-time collapse in the value of the monetary medium is tragic, but at least it's over quickly, and its holders can begin trading, saving, and calculating with a new, harder money. But a slow drain of its monetary value over time will slowly transfer the wealth of its holders to those who can produce the medium at a low cost. The real impact of the widespread culture of conspicuous consumption, where people live their lives to buy ever larger quantities of crap that they do not need, when the alternative of spending money is witnessing your savings lose value over time, you might as well enjoy spending it before it loses value. The financial decisions of people also reflected on all other aspects of their personality, endangering a high time preference in all aspects of life. Depreciating currencies cause less savings, more borrowing, more short-termism in economic production and in artistic and cultural endeavors, and perhaps most damagingly, the depletion of the soil of its nutrients, leading to ever lower levels of nutritious food. The cultural conspicuous consumption of shopping as therapy, of always needing to replace cheap plastic crap with newer, flashier cheap plastic crap, will not have a place in a society with a money which appreciates in value over time. Such a world would cause people to develop a lower time preference, as their monetary decisions will orient their actions towards the future, teaching them to value the future more and more. We can thus see how such a society would cause people not only to save and invest more, but also to be morally, artistically, and culturally oriented towards the long-term future. Contrarily, with sound money and an unwavering supply schedule, as the economy grows, the purchasing power of money increases, because entrepreneurs no longer have the uncertainty of an unchanging money supply. They can dedicate more of their resources to productive use cases, as there is the potential of multi-generational wealth preservation. Individuals are incentivized to increase their time preference and increase their planning horizon. Long-lasting, monumental projects can now be focused upon as the need for recurring consumption is decreased. Entrepreneurs can focus on innovating and improving living conditions, saving and investing ideas for long-term capital accumulations. A world of constant money supply would be one similar to that of much of the 18th and 19th century, marking the successful flowering of the Industrial Revolution, which increased capital investment, increased the supply of goods, and with falling prices for those goods, as well as falling costs of production. It is no wonder that the golden era of innovation in the 19th century, La Belle Époque, was the world recurring on the hard money, because that hard money is what allowed all these many inventors and tinkerers the capital and freedom to experiment with outlandish ideas. As Bitcoin is even harder money compared to gold, it might usher in an era of tremendous prosperity, capital accumulation, and wealth preservation. This has long-lasting effects, not just on the economy, but on the minds of free, sovereign individuals. Gresham's Law, Chapter 7. On the free market, a good is always to be valued according to the individual's subjective preference. Assuming two goods are exactly equal, they will be valued the same. If there are two almost identical coins, gold coins, each in pristine conditions, and with precisely 1 ounce of gold, they will be valued equally by any market participants. Thus, the coins are fungible. Suppose the coins have experimented degrading and clipping, now only containing 0.9 gold ounces. In a voluntary exchange, the coin will only be worth 90% of the previous 1 ounce of gold. However, if the government introduces legal tender laws as a form of price control, it decreases that the worn coins have to be valued equally to the new coins, and they must be accepted as equal in payment of debts. The old coins are thus artificially overvalued, and new coins artificially undervalued. This act set as a maximum price on the type of money in relation to another. Maximum prices usually cause in a shortage. That is, the undervalued good coin will be hoarded, while the overvalued old coin will be solely used in exchange. Gresham's law says that money overvalued artificially by government will drive out the circulation artificially undervalued money. Thus, there is nothing less fit to be left to the action of competition than money. If it is important to emphasize that Gresham's law only applies to different kinds of money in between which is a fixed exchange rate enforced by the state. If due to the law, two different monies are treated as substitutes for the payment of debt, creditors are being forced to accept a coin of smaller gold content in place of one with larger content. Thus, debtors will only pay with the smaller coin and use the larger as a store of value. As the cryptocurrency market is free from most state interventions, Gresham's law does not apply to the different digital assets. However, there is government coercion with legal tender laws in fiat money, with artificially overvalued state currency. If Alice has both fiat and Bitcoin in her possession, she is seeking to exchange them for goods and services. It is rational that she will first spend the fiat money as its price is artificially increased. Further, as the fiat money base is continuously inflated, it will be continue to depreciate in purchasing power and thus incentivizing spending over rational saving. Alice will retain her sound and hard Bitcoin until she no longer has any artificially overvalued fiat. At this point, where she has fully moved to the voluntary and sound economy of Bitcoin, her time preference has decreased accordingly, and she will adjust her spending patterns. And now she will willingly exchange her sound Bitcoin for precious goods and services which she actually needs, and not because she is artificially incentivized to overconsume. So far, few individuals have fully thrown off all their fiat bags, but those that did now experience the total realignment of their time preference to a voluntary market economy. Historically, it has been good, strong currencies that have driven out bad, weak currencies over the span of several millennia. Strong currencies have dominated and driven out weak in international competition. The Persian Daric, the Greek tetramanica, the Macedonian stater, and the Roman denarius did not become dominant currencies of ancient world because they were bad or weak. The florins, ducats, and sequins of Italian city-states did not become the dollar of the Middle Ages because they were bad coins. They were among the best coins ever made. The pound sterling of the 19th century and the dollar in the 20th century did not become the dominant currency of their time because they were weak. Consistency, stability, and high quality has been the attributes of great currency that have won the competition of use as international money. Speculative attack, Chapter 8. As the demand for fiat currency increases, it will initially increase its value, which will incentivize central banks and governments to produce additional units of money. This will increase the money supply, lowering the stock-to-flow ratio, and thus decreasing the purchasing power of the fiat currency. As the money is now less valuable, it is also cheaper to borrow and pay back at a later point in time at a further decrease in purchasing power. The increased inflation rate will thus incentivize the accumulation of additional debt, which will again increase the money supply, further weakening the currency. Thus, the liabilities side of Alice's balance sheet will increase in mortgages and consumer loans. Fractional reserve bank credit creation does not just increase the money supply. The flip side of this coin is that money supply increases and lower interest rates drive demand for more credit creation. Let's assume that there is a sound and hard monetary alternative to the fiat money, and that the fiat debtor will exchange their fiat currency for this sound money. The increase, the demand for the sound money, which will, due to an unchanging stock-to-flow ratio, increase its purchasing power. Thus, simultaneously, the fiat currency will decrease in purchasing power as the additional debt is taken on, and the sound money will increase in value. Those speculators now hold more valuable money and have to pay back the less valuable money, netting a sustainable profit. Thus, the assets side of Alice's balance sheet will increase in total Bitcoin hodlings. The effect of people, businesses, and financial institutions borrowing their local currencies to buy Bitcoin is that the Bitcoin price in that currency would go up relatively to other currencies. The central bank would have to either increase interest rates to break the cycle, impose capital controls, or spend their foreign currency reserves trying to prop up the rupee's exchange rate. Only raising interest rates would be a sustainable solution, though it would throw the country into a recession. The rational and action of economic participants would thus be to go into debt in the weak currency and accumulate sound money Bitcoin. As soon as the public became familiar with the new possibilities, any deviation from the straight path of providing an honest money would at once lead to the rapid displacement of the offending currency by others. This is not just a hypothetical construct, as there are countless examples of people taking on fiat debt and mortgaging their houses to buy even more Bitcoin. Curiously, so far the stock-to-flow ratio of fiat money was higher than that of Bitcoin, but only in the early days. Especially with the next halving in 2020, the inflation rate of Bitcoin will be much lower than that in fiat, further increasing this effect. A hyper-Bitcoinization event will be much quicker than a hyperinflation event. I have two reasons for this. First, the government will have a much greater difficulty preventing Bitcoins from entering the country due to the impotency of capital controls upon it. Secondary, hyperinflation is inherently an attempt to fool people, whereas hyper-Bitcoinization is quite regular and predictable, at least in comparison. Therefore, people will more easily see that they had better switch over. Thus, as fast as hyperinflation is, hyper-Bitcoinization will be even faster. Hyper-Bitcoinization will not disrupt the economy to nearly the same extent as hyperinflation. The currency is the instrument of the division of labor, and hyperinflation makes it unreliable and forces people to use worse alternatives. In hyper-Bitcoinization, people switch from the fundamentally inferior currency to a superior one. Whereas in the hyperinflationary event, people will only switch to a new currency once the old currency becomes worse than the next best alternative, such as gold or the detergent. Hyper-Bitcoinizations should be accompanied by rapid improvements in productivity and wealth. And Chapter 9, Scarcity. There are two different types of goods, scarce and non-scarce. If taking the original good eliminates the possession of the previous owner, it is a scarce good. If the good can be taken without displacing the original, it is non-scarce. Most goods, however, are a combination of both. A 3D tangible object is scarce. There can be conflict over who has the right to own and use such good. The very possibility of such a conflict makes economical and ethical rules over who controls that good necessary. Property rights are the fundamental tool to organize such scarce goods and prevent never-ending conflict over these resources. Property rights. Only because scarcity exists is there even the problem of formulating moral laws. Insofar as goods are superabundant, free goods, no conflict over the use of goods is possible and no action coordination is needed. Property is a concept of a mutually binding rule that enables conflict-free interactions in a scarce world. At the minimum, there exists scarcity in the body and time of humankind, even in a hypothetical construct of superabundance. Property rights in body and time are thus the precondition of all sovereign human action. Only the true owner of the body can by sheer power of will directly coordinate and manage it. Scarcity does not automatically create a price of the good, as there also presupposes demand for such a good. A mud pie is by definition scarce, yet there can be conflict over who owns and controls it, but most likely it will not have a price in the market. Nor does scarcity refer to the quantity available to the god or the rarity of it. Scarcity is thus defined by the possibility of arising conflict over the true owner and manager of a finite thing. It applies to anything and everything that cannot be simultaneously owned. For example, one's ownership and control excludes others. Social ownership does not apply. Scarce goods can only be acquired either by the homesteading of unused resources or by the economics means, for example, trading in a voluntary market, or by the political means, for example, forcefully stealing the good from an unwilling subject. Scarce goods are allocated and rationed by prices in the free market. On the other hand, a non-scarce good, which due to their superabundance, are not subject to desire and choice. Those free goods don't have value in the classical sense, but they exist in superfluity. They gratify and also satisfy all desires which depend on them. It is thus a non-finite good, which can be replicable without limit, so that everyone can satisfy his desire for it, and that there is no conflict over ownership. No additional copy will replace the previous copy, nor degrade the quality of the copied good. Ideas can be kept exclusively by the owner as long as he keeps it to himself. But as soon as he utters the thoughts, they force themselves into the possession of everyone that heard these words. The peculiar attribute is that the original thinker still holds full possession over his idea, and all other receive the full expression without any loss. Similar to the match that can light another without becoming extinct by the passing of the flame. This is a benevolent design of nature, that ideas can be shared freely and openly without lessening the quality and at no cost to the original thinker. When speaking words, they can be taken all to oneself, yet leave all to others, and unless the memory fades away, everyone who can hear those words can take them all and go on each separate way. A teacher's time and body is limited and scarce, and thus his payment is not for the sharing of non-scarce ideas, but for the presentation of his labor services, which is, of course, a scarce good. With the advent of the printing press, a sheer limitless number of books could be copied without losing any quality in the content, without destroying the original book. With new technologies such as laser printers and 3D printers, we can manufacture various tangible objects by using a recipe. The same is true for a song, which anyone can sing after it's initially performed. The concept further applies to all digital information, for example, a PDF document, MP3 music file, or JPEG picture, which can be copied perfectly ad infinitum for near zero cost. In general, the World Wide Web is an interconnected network of nodes, copying and sharing non-scarce goods, sending them to anyone who is interested in receiving them. As we continue moving towards the digital world, the number of non-scarce goods will continue to increase drastically. There is no conflict of ownership and control, and thus no property rights apply in cyberspace. Prices arise in scarce goods to ration the unique goods and allocate them to the most urgent needs. Because free goods are only guides for human action and can be copied to satisfy each other's desires, there are no property rights and no need to economize and ration them based on price. Although there is no structure of production where sharing a non-scarce good that can be economized and commercialized. Non-scarce goods are all kinds of thoughts, ideas, arts, and all other information, and therefore essentially everyday life. Without these free gifts, there would be no innovation, no learning, nor advancement. Society can only progress through imitation of accumulated knowledge. Entrepreneurs emulate the success of others and gather experience also from failings. Profits incentivize new entrepreneurs to copy the successful business model and adapt it to their unique circumstances. Non-scarce goods are thus the driver of all competitive businesses. These designs, the recipes, the formulas, the ideologies are the primary thing that transform the original factors, both human and non-human, into means. Once the idea is produced, it is no longer has to be produced. It is an unlimited factor of production. Ideas themselves do not create wealth, but rather the action that arises out of this initial thought. Now that we have established that ideas are non-scarce good, we should therefore be shared openly with anyone, let us consider government-enforced intellectual property rights. The name itself already contains a fallacy, as only scarce goods give rise to the property rights, and in order to organize and allocate these resources. Because ideas are non-scarce, there are no property rights necessary to ration these goods. It can be shared endlessly at almost no cost to the original thinker. Rather, sharing an idea and propagating it throughout society increases the value of the idea, as more people know about it, can understand it, and eventually act upon them accordingly. Only when the thought is shared can it outlive the original thinker. With intellectual property rights, not the original thinker, but the person that first registers the idea at a state institution receives the monopoly right to the use of this idea. Only he has the legal right to manifest the thought into reality. If anyone else dares to act upon this idea, the patent holder is supported by government thugs in aggressively stopping or hindering that manifestation. This also applies even though another person might come up with the ideas independently and without any knowledge of the previous thinker. If this person who possesses the rightful property in the original factors, with the application of the ideas turns them into means, the patentee is supported in violating the property rights and confiscating or destroying the property of otherwise extracting wealth from the second thinker. Intellectual property rights thus break the fundamental nature of non-scarce good and tries to introduce artificial scarcity where none exists. A good that can be gifted freely and openly to anyone is limited without any need to do so. Nobody is stolen from when sharing an idea. Furthermore, the person that apparently stole the idea is violated in the property rights and liberty. Thugs literally steal his property on the basis that some other person had a thought before him. This regulation not only hinders the general advancement of society through the artificial scarcity of free and limitless good, but further break the natural law inherent in creation. Intellectual property is thus neither economically sound nor morally righteous. Early cypherpunks realized the economic and moral fallacy of intellectual property and saw the immense potential of creating a community in cyberspace where free, non-scarce goods can be shared open and widely as possible. A fundamental building block of today's internet is the realization that code is non-scarce speech and therefore protected by the natural law of freedom of speech and expression. This especially applies to privacy-enhancing technologies such as encryption. The natural conclusion of this realization is that the code of each and every application should be open source, that it is shared, and that anyone can see and edit the source code of the software. Only this way can the sheer limitless potential of non-scarce goods be reached. Once the code is written, it can be shared at no cost to the creator. It is evident that there is no perfect and bug-free code. Thus, the more developers take a look at the code and check for validity and security, the more refined the code will be. Permissionless innovation means that anyone can work on any problem and try to solve it. Nobody has to ask for permission in order to fix or break something, just like nobody has to ask permission to write a poem or sing a song. This creates countless black swan events where a seamlessly unsolvable problem is solved in an unexpected but brilliant approach. Nobody thought about this, but one person somewhere on the interwebs did. As soon as this hidden genius shares his solution to the problem, he has unleashed the power of the non-scarce idea, and everybody can copy, adapt, and improve it. Only one person in a billion needs to find the solution. If he freely shares it with the world, everyone will benefit. Therefore, free software will always outperform any guarded and closed source software. Open software wins. Further, the software user should have full control and trust in the hands, heart, and software that he's running. In a closed source system, there is no possibility of the user to check if the software is doing what it is advertised to do. He has to blindly trust the intransparent developers. Contrarily, in an open source system, the user can, if he has the ability, verify for himself what the code is and if the software is running secure and sound. Even if the user himself does not have the ability to verify the code's validity, he can verify that there are developers working on improving and bug fixing. If those developers are reputable and the user can trust their skill and dedication, he has a much higher assurance that the code is clean. Don't trust, verify. Bitcoin is entirely and relentlessly open source. Each and every line of code is auditable. Several thousand volunteers work on the code in an equal and transparent process. Everybody can fork the code, make changes, and issue pull requests to merge the code. However, this does not mean that anyone can easily change the code of the Bitcoin Core client or even the protocol rules. There's a rigorous peer review process where even the most trivial of changes get audited by several different developers. Nobody trusts anyone. Bitcoin spawns out of the internet, of open source, non-scarce goods, a protocol on the network. The software running on consensus code is fully transparent and auditable by every single full node. It can be downloaded and installed on any scarce hardware that the individual owns. Bitcoin is entirely and relentlessly open source. Each and every line of a private key is only a large random number, a piece of information that is non-scarce and can be copied endlessly without any cost and at no loss to anyone. However, in this Bitcoin script corresponding to a UTXO, there can be the requirements to prove control over this private key with an elliptic curve digital signature. Thus, only with knowledge of the private key can the Bitcoin be spent. Other Bitcoin script programs can assign the claim to the Bitcoin to anyone who can fulfill all the conditions, like proof of knowledge of several private keys with a multi-signature, or a time delay in check sequence verify. Further advanced smart contracts, such as the Lightning Network, can shift the state of a multi-sig off-chain. All these scripts provide a clear set of rules over who has access and the right to control the specific Bitcoin. With a brilliant pattern of speech, Nakamoto consensus emerges cryptographically proven scarcity. In order to secure this attribute of scarcity, Bitcoin employs a plethora of economic incentives and applies monetary theory. In order to secure Bitcoin against double spend and duplication of UTXOs, miners order and timestamp transactions and accumulate cryptographic proof of work. Because miners gain economic financial gains and profits with scarce Bitcoin in the Coinbase report, they are incentivized to adhering to consensus rules, with a majority of miners accepting consensus as defined by individual sovereign nodes. The chain with the most accumulated proof of work contains the valid time order of transaction. Thus, proof of work is needed to defend Bitcoin's scarcity even against malicious actors, trying to use the same UTXO set twice. Running a node and accumulating valid proof of work is a tool for defending the Nakamoto consensus, which upholds the attributes of scarcity of Bitcoin. Chapter 10. Conclusion. Money is a tool to postpone the gratification of desires into the uncertain future. This aspect as a store of value is enhanced with a predictable and hard money supply. In Bitcoin, the issuance rate is set by Nakamoto consensus, which is voluntarily agreed upon, unchangeable, and thus no theft. This decreases the time preference of peers and increases overall capital accumulation and savings. However, due to the initial stock-to-flow ratio, malinvestment and overconsumption have manifested, which will be readjusted as the issuance rate of Bitcoin decreases exponentially. A non-scarce piece of information, the private key, can be used to transfer control of a scarce Bitcoin, thus fulfilling the medium of exchange function. And due to the sound monetary theory, hyper-Bitcoinization will occur sooner rather than later, and Bitcoin will function as a reliable unit of account, decreasing the complexity of deep production stages and reducing entrepreneurial cost. Self-sovereign nodes make up their own individual rule set, query the network, and only connect to peers that voluntarily agree upon the same monetary consensus. No one represents these users as they are in full control over their open source software and secure their private keys. There is no theft of private property whatsoever. All actions are agreed upon voluntarily and mutually beneficial. Thus, Bitcoin is fundamentally based in the moral principles of natural law and liberty. Of course, this paper was written in an open source collaboration process, and with support from several individuals and conversations, interviews, and discussions. Some of these are available on the World Crypto Network YouTube channel and the GitHub of Max Hillebrand /Anarchy and Money. I especially want to thank the entire Bitcoin community for their tireless dedication to manifest sound money in liberty in our lifetime. Don't trust, verify, and run your own full node. Specifically, though, I want to thank, in alphabetical order, all the amazing individuals who have advanced the theory of sound money and liberty and have accumulated this information so that peers can build upon it. Samuel Adams, Saifedean Ammous, Thomas Aquinas, Michael Bakunin, Richard Cantillon, Frank Albert Vetter, Frank Walter Vetter, Mark Friedenbach, Jack Gein, Friedrich August von Hayek, Henry Hazlitt, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, Jörg Guido Holzmann, Isman Otmar, Thomas Jefferson, William Stanley Jeffons, Stephen Kinsella, Daniel Kravitz, Marshall Lehouan, Carl Menger, John Stuart Mill, Ludwig von Mises, Robert Mundell, Satoshi Nakamoto, Pierre Rochard, Jonathan Rosenberg, the hero, Murray Rothbard, Thomas Schelling, Ken Sheriff, Lysander Spooner, Leo Strauss, Nick Szabo, Nassim Taleb, Jorge Timon, Peter Todd, William van Waldenberg, and Gary Willis. As you can see here in the appendix, the volatility decrease of Bitcoin's purchasing power, and further, Bitcoin's voluntarily chosen money supply and issuance rate. Peers, this has been Anarchy in Money, a paper written by Max Hillebrand and dedicate it to the heroes of liberty, Murray Rothbard and Satoshi Nakamoto. Thank you very much for joining me, and see you on the next show. Bye-bye.